Why you still feel different from everyone else. The feeling that has no name. You don't feel broken. You just feel like you're always slightly outside of everything. Not depressed, not antisocial, not incapable of connection. Just off. Like everyone else received an instruction manual for how to exist in the world, and yours never arrived. Like you are always translating yourself into a language that doesn't quite capture what you actually mean. Always a half step removed from the moment you're standing in. And the strangest part is that no one can see it. From the outside, you function. You show up. You engage. You say the right things at the right times. But inside, there is a persistent, quiet awareness that something is fundamentally different about the way you experience being alive. And you have spent years unable to name it, unable to prove it, and unable to make it stop. You tried. You tried being more present, more social, more positive. You tried therapy, self-help, spiritual practices, new environments, new relationships. And some of it helped. But none of it touched the core of it. That deep, unshakable sense that you are wired for a frequency the world around you simply doesn't broadcast. So you did what emotionally intelligent people do when they can't solve something. You adapted. You masked. You learned which parts of yourself were safe to show and which parts needed to stay hidden. And over time, that adaptation became so automatic, so seamless that you forgot you were doing it. You started to lose track of where the performance ended and where you actually began. That is not a small thing. That is years of quiet self-abandonment in the name of surviving a world that never quite felt like yours. This video is not going to tell you to love yourself more. It is not going to offer you a morning routine or a reframing exercise or a gentle reminder that you are enough. Because the problem was never that you lacked self-love. The problem is that no one has ever given you an accurate psychological explanation for why you feel this way. And without that understanding, every attempt to fix it has been like treating a wound without knowing what caused it. What follows is that explanation. Not comfort, not inspiration. Understanding. And once you have it, something will shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the deep, quiet way that things shift when you finally see something clearly that you have been trying to understand your entire life. The psychology of never fitting. It was never shyness. It was never a phase. And it was never something you could have simply decided your way out of, no matter how many times you tried. There is a specific psychological pattern that runs beneath the experience of never quite fitting. And it is not about social skill, confidence, or the right attitude. It is about something that was already present before you had the language to describe it. A fundamental difference in how your mind processes, registers, and responds to the world around you. Most people move through social environments on autopilot. They absorb the unspoken rules of a room, mirror the emotional tone of the people around them, and navigate belonging with an ease that looks almost effortless from the outside. Not because they are better at being human, but because the frequency of those environments matches something inside them that was never calibrated to match something inside you. You noticed things they didn't notice. You felt undercurrents they walked straight through. You registered the tension beneath the laughter, the loneliness behind the confidence, the performance hiding inside what everyone else called normal. And rather than making you feel connected to the human experience, that awareness made you feel more alone inside it. Because you were perceiving a layer of reality that the conversation around you never acknowledged. That is not a malfunction. That is a perceptual difference. And perceptual differences do not respond to willpower. The psychological research on this is precise. Individuals with high levels of emotional sensitivity and neural complexity do not simply experience more emotion, they process experience itself differently. The same social interaction that registers as pleasant background noise for one person can register as a full emotional event for another. The same environment that feels neutral to most can feel overwhelming, hollow, or emotionally unsatisfying to someone whose inner world operates at a fundamentally different depth. You were not failing at belonging. You were attempting to belong in spaces that were never built for the way you actually work. And here is the part that no one tells you. The exhaustion you feel is not from being different. It is from the decades of effort spent trying to be less so. Every room you walked into and quietly recalibrated yourself for. Every conversation where you filtered your actual thoughts before speaking. Every relationship where you gave the version of you that felt acceptable rather than the version that felt true. That filtering has a cumulative psychological cost, and the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to remember what you were filtering in the first place. The feeling of never fitting was never a sign that something went wrong. It was a sign that something in you was too specific, too layered, too internally complex to dissolve into environments that rewarded simplicity. And that specificity, as uncomfortable as it has been to carry, is the beginning of something this video will return to. But first, you need to understand what was happening inside your body long before any of this had a name. The nervous system nobody understood. Before you ever developed a personality, before you formed your first memory, before you learned how to speak or think in language, your nervous system was already deciding how you would experience the world. And yours was always turned up higher than most. This is not metaphor. This is neurobiology. There is a documented spectrum of nervous system sensitivity, the degree to which a person's neural architecture registers, processes, and responds to sensory, emotional, and social input. At one end, there are people whose systems filter aggressively, letting most stimuli pass without deep processing. At the other end, there are people whose systems absorb everything, not just the obvious, but the subtle, the atmospheric, the unspoken, the emotional residue of a room long after the people have left. You were born closer to that second end. What that means in practice is this: the world has always been louder inside you than it appeared to be outside you. Other people's emotions landed on you with a weight that felt disproportionate. Environments affected your mood in ways you couldn't always explain or justify. Transitions between places, between emotional states, between versions of yourself depending on who you were with, required a kind of internal recalibration that most people never needed to perform. And because no one around you seemed to be experiencing it the same way, you drew the only conclusion that made sense at the time. Something was wrong with you. That conclusion was incorrect, but it was understandable. Because a highly sensitized nervous system in a world that pathologizes sensitivity will always interpret its own nature as a defect. Here is what was actually happening. Your nervous system was doing precisely what it was designed to do. Processing experience at depth. The problem was not the processing. The problem was the absence of any framework to understand it, any permission to honor it, or any environment calibrated to accommodate it. So instead of learning to work with your nervous system, you spent years working against it, pushing through overstimulation, ignoring emotional saturation, forcing yourself into social situations that drained you completely and then feeling ashamed that they did. That shame compounded everything. Because when you feel ashamed of the way your system naturally operates, you do not seek to understand it. You seek to suppress it. And suppression of a highly active nervous system does not make it quieter, it makes it louder. And it adds a layer of internal conflict on top of the original experience. A constant low-grade war between what you feel and what you believe you are supposed to feel. That war is exhausting in a way that sleep does not fix, in a way that vacations do not resolve, in a way that only becomes clear when you finally stop fighting your own neurological reality and begin, for the first time, to actually understand it. Your nervous system was never the enemy. It was always the messenger. And what it has been trying to tell you, through the overwhelm, the hypersensitivity, the emotional saturation, the desperate need for solitude and silence, is something far more important than a list of coping strategies. It has been trying to show you the shape of who you actually are, the hidden cost of constant adaptation. No one handed you a script, no one sat you down and explained the rules, but you learned them anyway, through observation, through trial and error, through the subtle but unmistakable feedback of social environments that rewarded certain versions of you and quietly punished others. You learned what was too much, what was too intense, what made people uncomfortable, what made them pull back, what made the conversation go flat. And because you were perceptive enough to notice those signals and emotionally invested enough to care about them, You began adjusting, editing, calibrating. At first it felt like social intelligence, like emotional maturity, like the sophisticated ability to read a room and respond accordingly. And in some ways, it was. But beneath the surface of that adaptation, something else was happening, something that would not become fully visible until much later. You were slowly building a secondary self, not a false self in the dramatic sense, not a conscious performance or a deliberate deception. Something more subtle and more insidious than that, a gradual accumulation of adjustments, each one small and seemingly reasonable in isolation, that together added up to a version of you that could function in the world, but that bore an increasingly distant relationship to the person underneath. The psychological term for this process is self-monitoring, and research consistently shows that individuals with high emotional intelligence and social sensitivity tend to engage in it at significantly elevated levels. They are better at reading what others need, better at adjusting their presentation accordingly, better at making other people feel comfortable, and quietly, consistently, invisibly, they pay for that skill with their own sense of self. Because every act of adaptation, however small, carries an implicit message. It says, the version of me that exists naturally is not quite acceptable here. And when that message is delivered enough times, across enough environments, across enough years, it stops feeling like a social observation and starts feeling like a fundamental truth about who you are. That is where the real damage happens, not in any single moment of rejection or misunderstanding, but in the slow accumulation of self-editing that eventually makes you a stranger to your own inner experience. You stop knowing what you actually think before you consider how it will land. You stop knowing what you actually feel before you assess whether it is appropriate to feel it. The gap between your internal experience and your external expression widens so gradually that you barely notice it happening. Until one day you are sitting alone and you realize you are not entirely sure who you are when no one is watching. That is not a crisis. That is a signal. It means the cost of adaptation has finally become too high to ignore. It means some part of you, the part that has been quietly buried under years of adjustment and performance, is asking to be found again. And before that can happen, you need to understand exactly what it was you were hiding and why. The mask nobody asked you to wear. No one told you to hide. That is the part that makes it so difficult to understand and so difficult to undo. There was no single moment, no dramatic event, no clear instruction that said, the real you is not welcome here. Instead, there were 1,000 smaller moments. A comment that landed wrong. A silence that followed something you said. A room that shifted almost imperceptibly when you were too honest, too intense, too unfiltered. And because you were sensitive enough to register those shifts and intelligent enough to draw conclusions from them, you did what any adaptive mind would do. You made note, you adjusted, you protected yourself. The mask you wear was not built out of dishonesty. It was built out of intelligence, out of the very perceptiveness that makes you who you are. You saw clearly what the world responded to, and you gave it that, not because you were weak, but because you were paying attention. Because somewhere early on, showing the full depth of your inner world produced a reaction that felt like unsafety, and your nervous system filed that information away with the precision of a system designed for survival. The problem is that survival mechanisms do not distinguish between actual danger and social discomfort. They do not evaluate whether the risk is real or perceived. They simply respond to the signal, and the signal, repeated often enough, becomes a rule that eventually operates beneath conscious awareness, so deep in your behavioral architecture that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like personality. And this is where it becomes genuinely complicated, because when the mask stays on long enough, you begin to identify with it. You begin to experience the performance as the self, and the actual self, the one underneath, begins to feel unfamiliar, even threatening, because the unmasked version of you has not been tested in the world for a very long time. You do not know how it will be received. You do not know if it is safe. And safety, for a nervous system that learned early to associate authenticity with risk, will always feel more important than truth. So you keep the mask on. Not because you want to, but because you have forgotten that taking it off is even an option. Here is what that costs you beyond the exhaustion of maintenance. It costs you intimacy. Real intimacy, the kind that requires being actually seen, not skillfully presented, becomes structurally impossible when the version of you that shows up in relationships is a curated one. People can love the mask. They often do. But their love lands on a surface rather than a depth, and somewhere inside you, you register that distance. You feel the loneliness of being loved for a version of yourself you are not entirely sure is real, and then you wonder why connection always feels slightly incomplete. This is why. Not because the people in your life are wrong for you, not because you are incapable of closeness, but because the architecture of self-protection you built, with perfect logic, for perfectly good reasons, is also the architecture that keeps genuine contact just out of reach. The mask was never the problem. The fact that you forgot you were wearing it, that is what needs to change. When connection feels like performance. You want connection. That is not in question. In fact, the ache for it runs deeper in you than it does in most people, precisely because you are capable of a quality of closeness that requires the other person to also be willing to go beneath the surface, and most people are not. Most people experience connection as pleasant proximity, shared activity, mutual comfort, a reliable presence that does not demand too much emotional depth. And that is not a criticism. That is simply the reality of how the majority of human relationships function, at a register that feels, to you, like the first few inches of a body of water that goes down for miles. You have spent years trying to dive with people who were only ever going to wade. And the specific kind of loneliness that produces, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who genuinely care about you, who are doing nothing wrong, who are offering you exactly what they are capable of offering, is one of the most disorienting emotional experiences a person can have, because it gives you no one to blame and no clear problem to solve. The people are good, the relationships are real, and you still feel fundamentally unreached. What happens to someone who feels chronically unreached, even in the presence of genuine affection, is subtle but devastating. They begin to perform connection rather than experience it. They learn the rhythms of closeness, the appropriate vulnerability, the well-timed humor, the emotional availability that reads as genuine because it partially is. And they move through relationships with the competence of someone who understands intimacy deeply but experiences it at a remove. You become fluent in a language you are not sure you are actually speaking. And the terrible irony of this is that your fluency in emotional language, your ability to read people, to attune to their needs, to make them feel understood, often results in others feeling deeply connected to you, while you feel something more ambiguous, something that contains genuine warmth, but also a quiet awareness that the connection is partially constructed, that you are bringing skill where you wanted to bring self. That awareness is not cynicism, it is grief. It is the grief of someone who knows what real contact feels like, who has caught glimpses of it, perhaps in rare conversations that went somewhere unexpected, or in moments of unexpected honesty that neither person planned, and who spends the rest of the time navigating the distance between what is and what is possible. The performance is not fake. That is the nuance most people miss. When you perform connection, you are not being dishonest. You are being protective. You are offering the version of intimacy that feels survivable, close enough to feel something, contained enough to stay safe. Because full exposure, genuine self-disclosure, the kind of contact that requires bringing the unedited, unmasked, unperformed version of yourself into the relationship, that feels like a risk your nervous system has been quietly refusing to take for a very long time. The question is not whether you are capable of real connection. The question is what it would take for you to finally stop performing it and actually allow it. The loneliness that lives inside belonging. There is a loneliness that the word loneliness does not adequately describe. Not the loneliness of isolation, of empty weekends and unanswered messages and the particular silence of a life without people. That loneliness is painful, but it is at least legible. It has a clear shape. It points to an obvious absence. The loneliness you know is different. It lives inside presence, inside gatherings and relationships and moments that are, by every external measure, the opposite of lonely. It is the loneliness of being in the room, and somehow not quite in the room, of laughing at the right moments and saying the right things and feeling, underneath all of it, a soft but persistent sense of separation that you cannot name and cannot bridge. That experience has a specific psychological signature. It is not depression, though it can feel adjacent to it. It is not social anxiety, though it sometimes produces similar behaviors. It is something more precise, a form of existential disconnection that emerges specifically in people whose inner world operates at a depth that their external environment consistently fails to meet. Think of it this way. You are broadcasting on a frequency. The people around you are tuned to a different one. The signal is going out. There is simply no receiver calibrated to pick it up. And the result is not silence. It is something worse than silence. It is the experience of being present, expressive, engaged, and still fundamentally unheard. That is what creates the loneliness inside belonging. Not the absence of people, the absence of resonance. And here is where it becomes psychologically complex, because people who experience this kind of loneliness often respond to it not by withdrawing, which would at least be honest about the disconnection, but by doubling down on the performance of belonging, by becoming more socially capable, more emotionally attuned, more skilled at creating the experience of connection for others even as they feel it receding inside themselves. You became very good at making people feel seen, at asking the right questions, at holding space for emotional experiences that you privately understood at a level the other person had not yet reached. And in doing so, you created relationships where the intimacy flowed predominantly in one direction, outward from you, rarely back toward you at the depth you needed. The loneliness this produces is not simple. It contains genuine warmth, genuine care, genuine investment in the people around you. But it also contains a quiet exhaustion. The exhaustion of always being the one who reaches, of giving a quality of understanding that is rarely returned in kind, of being the emotional container for other people's inner lives while your own remains largely unwitnessed. There is a question underneath that exhaustion. Not a dramatic question. A quiet one, asked in the moments between everything else. Is there anyone out there who experiences things the way I do? That question does not always get a clean answer. But the fact that you are asking it, the fact that it persists beneath all the belonging and connection and functional intimacy of your daily life, is not a sign of ingratitude or emotional dysfunction. It is a sign of exactly how deep your capacity for genuine contact actually goes. The mind that never stops. At some point, you probably decided that the overthinking was the problem, that if you could just quiet the internal monologue, stop analyzing, stop replaying conversations, stop running scenarios, stop processing and reprocessing the same emotional material, everything else would settle into place. But the overthinking was never the root. It was always the symptom. And understanding what it is actually a symptom of changes everything about how you relate to it. The mind that never stops is not a malfunctioning mind. It is a mind that learned very early that the world required constant monitoring, that emotional environments were unpredictable enough to warrant vigilance, that reading the subtle signals of other people's moods, intentions, and reactions was not optional. It was necessary for navigation, for safety, for knowing how to adjust and respond and survive the emotional complexity of being in the world. In psychological terms, this is called hypervigilance, but not the dramatic kind associated with acute trauma. A quieter, more pervasive version. A background process that runs continuously, scanning for emotional data, cataloging reactions, building predictive models of how situations will unfold and how people will respond. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated cognitive operation. It is also an extraordinarily exhausting one. And here is the part that tends to land with particular force. The overthinking is not random. It follows a pattern. It clusters around specific anxieties, social interactions, relationships, self-perception, the gap between who you are and who the world seems to want you to be. It returns most intensely to situations where connection felt uncertain, where authenticity felt risky, where you were not sure if the real version of you would be welcome. The mind keeps returning to these places not because it is broken, but because it is trying to solve something. It is searching with the only tools it has for a resolution to an emotional problem that was never primarily cognitive in nature. And because thinking more has never solved a problem that thinking created, the loop continues, each pass through the material adding a layer of analysis without ever reaching the understanding that would actually allow the mind to rest. That understanding cannot come from more analysis. It can only come from recognition. The kind of recognition that happens not when you finally find the right explanation, but when something inside you shifts from trying to understand the experience to actually feeling it, fully, without immediately reaching for interpretation. The kind of presence with your own inner life that the overthinking mind perpetually delays by converting feeling into thought before the feeling has had a chance to complete itself. Your mind is not your enemy. It is one of the most powerful instruments you have, but it has been running a program it was never meant to run indefinitely, and until you understand why it started, you cannot give it permission to stop. The exhaustion you feel is not the exhaustion of thinking too much. It is the exhaustion of carrying an emotional weight that your mind keeps trying to think its way out of, while the weight itself remains untouched beneath the analysis. The identity you left behind. There is a version of you that existed before all the adaptation, before the mask, before the careful self-monitoring and the performance of connection, and the hyper-vigilant mind running its endless background calculations. A version that had not yet learned which parts of itself were safe to show and which parts needed to stay hidden. You may not remember that version clearly. It may feel like a distant, almost theoretical thing, something you sense the outline of rather than something you can fully access. But it is still there, not gone, not destroyed, just buried under the accumulated weight of years of adaptation, waiting with a patience that is, in retrospect, almost remarkable. The process by which people lose contact with their own identity is rarely dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment of rupture or crisis. It happens the way most significant psychological shifts happen, gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the compounding of small decisions that each felt reasonable in the moment. You showed a part of yourself, and it was met with discomfort, so you filed that part away. You expressed an emotion with full intensity and the room went quiet, so you learned to pre-filter before expressing. You shared a thought that was true and received a response that was polite, but fundamentally dismissive, so you began evaluating thoughts for palatability before speaking. None of these were catastrophic events, but they were instructions. And you, being the kind of person who learns quickly and adapts precisely, followed them with an efficiency that ultimately cost you something irreplaceable, the unmediated experience of your own inner life. Here is what identity suppression actually feels like from the inside, once it has been running long enough. It does not feel like suppression. It feels like normalcy. You stop noticing the editing because the editing has become part of the process. You stop feeling the gap between the internal and the external because you have become so practiced at closing it before it fully opens that you experience the closure as seamless. And then you arrive at a point that is disorienting in a very specific way. You are sitting alone, in a quiet moment without anyone to perform for, without any social context to calibrate yourself against. And you realize that the silence inside is not peaceful. It is uncertain. You are not entirely sure who you are in the absence of context, not sure what you actually think, want, feel, or value, as distinct from what you have learned to think, want, feel, and value in response to the expectations of your environment. That moment is not a breakdown. It is an arrival. It is the moment your authentic self, the one you adapted away from years ago, begins knocking from the inside. Not demanding, not dramatic, just persistent, just present, just quietly insisting that the distance between who you have been performing and who you actually are has finally grown too large to ignore. What you do with that knock determines everything that comes next. What your difference is actually telling you. You have spent a significant portion of your life experiencing your difference as a problem to be solved, as an obstacle between you and the belonging, connection, and ease that everyone around you seem to access without effort. And that framing, difference as deficiency, has shaped not just how you see yourself, but how you have moved through every relationship, every environment, every internal conversation about who you are and who you are supposed to become. But what if the framing itself is what was wrong? Not the difference. The interpretation of it. There is a long and well-documented history of human psychological experience being pathologized simply because it deviates from what the majority experiences. Emotional sensitivity labeled as instability. Perceptual depth labeled as overthinking. Introversion labeled as dysfunction. The inability to find satisfaction in shallow connection labeled as an attachment problem. And people who experience the world at a greater depth than average have, for most of recorded history, been handed the same implicit diagnosis. Too much, too sensitive, too intense, too interior, too complex. But here is what that diagnosis consistently missed. The people who feel most different are not experiencing a deficit in their humanity. They are experiencing a surplus of it, a greater range of emotional registration, a deeper capacity for meaning-making, a more acute awareness of the gap between how things are and how they could be, a sensitivity to nuance, to contradiction, to the invisible emotional undercurrents of human experience that most people process only partially, if at all. That is not a malfunction. That is a form of perception, and perception, however uncomfortable it makes the perceiver, is not something to be corrected. It is something to be understood, and eventually integrated into a coherent sense of self that stops treating its own depth as a liability. The difference you carry has been trying to tell you something specific. Not that you are broken, not that you are too much for the world, but that you are calibrated for a quality of experience, connection, and understanding that requires a very particular kind of environment, relationship, and internal relationship with yourself to actually flourish. Most of the pain you have experienced has not come from being different. It has come from spending your life trying to access belonging and connection through frameworks that were not built for the way you actually work. It has come from measuring yourself against standards designed for a different kind of psychology and consistently finding yourself inadequate by those standards. Stop measuring yourself with the wrong instrument. Your difference is not the obstacle between you and a meaningful life. It is the very thing that makes a meaningful life possible. If you stop trying to shrink it into something the world finds more manageable, and start building a relationship with it that is honest enough to honor what it actually is. That begins with a reframe, not a comfortable one, an honest one. The reframe that changes everything. Everything up to this point has been excavation. A careful layer-by-layer uncovering of the psychological and emotional architecture that has been shaping your inner life, often without your awareness. The nervous system wired for depth. The adaptation that became identity. The mask that outlasted its original purpose. The loneliness inside belonging. The mind running a program it was never meant to run forever. You have seen the mechanics of it now. And that matters. But understanding the structure of a pattern and actually shifting out of it are two different things. The shift requires something beyond comprehension. It requires a change in the fundamental story you are telling yourself about who you are and why you are this way. Here is the reframe. You did not feel different from everyone else because something went wrong. You felt different because something went right. And the world around you, by and large, lacked the psychological sophistication to recognize it as such. That is not arrogance. It is accuracy. The traits that made you feel most alienated, your depth of feeling, your perceptual sensitivity, your inability to find satisfaction in shallow connection, your nervous system's insistence on registering everything at full volume, are not aberrations of human psychology. They are expressions of its higher range. They are the traits consistently associated with creative depth, emotional intelligence, moral complexity, and the capacity for the kind of meaning-making that transforms not just individual lives, but the cultures and communities those individuals inhabit. The problem was never that you had too much. The problem was that you were handed the wrong context for what you were carrying. A violin does not sound wrong in a room full of people who have only ever heard drums, but it will feel wrong to the violin. And if the violin spends enough time in that room, it may begin to believe that its own sound is the problem, when the actual problem is simply the absence of an appropriate acoustic environment. You have been trying to resonate in the wrong room for a very long time. The reframe is not about suddenly feeling comfortable everywhere. It is not about deciding that your sensitivity is beautiful, and your depth is a gift, and everything that was painful was secretly wonderful. That kind of forced positivity is its own form of self-abandonment. The reframe is more honest than that. It is the recognition that what you have been experiencing as a curse, the intensity, the disconnection, the exhaustion of being wired this way in a world that was not designed for it, is inseparable from what is most real and most valuable about who you are. You cannot have the depth without the weight of it. You cannot have the sensitivity without the overwhelm. You cannot have the capacity for profound connection without the loneliness of living in its absence. These are not flaws attached to gifts. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. And when you finally stop trying to keep the gift while eliminating the weight, when you accept both as part of the same psychological reality, something in you stops fighting, not in defeat, in recognition. That recognition is the beginning of the only kind of change that actually lasts. Coming home to yourself. After everything, after the years of adaptation and masking and performing and searching and analyzing and trying to solve something that was never meant to be solved, only understood, there is a question that eventually rises to the surface with a quiet insistence that is impossible to ignore. Who are you when you stop trying to be acceptable? Not who do you want to be, not who do you think you should be. Who are you right now, beneath all the layers of adjustment and self-monitoring and careful presentation that you have been wearing so long they started to feel like skin? That question does not have an answer you can think your way to. It has an answer you have to become willing to feel your way toward, slowly, without the safety net of constant self-analysis, without the familiar comfort of understanding everything before you allow yourself to experience it. Coming home to yourself is not a dramatic event. It does not arrive as a revelation or a breakthrough or a sudden flooding of clarity after years of confusion. It arrives the way most real things arrive, quietly, incrementally, in small moments that accumulate into a new relationship with your own inner life. It arrives when you say something true without immediately scanning the room for the reaction, when you feel an emotion fully instead of converting it into a thought before it has a chance to complete itself. When you choose an environment, a relationship, a way of spending your time, based on what actually resonates, rather than what seems most acceptable. When you let the depth of you show up, not as performance, not as vulnerability theater, but simply as the natural expression of how you actually are. These are not grand gestures. They are small permissions, and they are cumulatively the most radical thing you can do after a lifetime of making yourself smaller. Because the truth, the one this entire video has been building toward, is this: you were never too much. You were too much for the wrong places, for the wrong relationships, for the wrong version of yourself that you spent years trying to maintain, but you were never too much in any absolute sense. There is no such thing as a person who is too alive, too feeling, too aware, too interior, too deep. There are only people who have not yet found the environment, the relationships, and the internal relationship with themselves that their particular nature requires to actually breathe. You have been holding your breath for a very long time, not because the air was gone, because you convinced yourself through years of accumulated evidence from environments that were not built for you, that your way of breathing was somehow wrong. It was not wrong. It was just unwitnessed. And here now, something has been witnessed, not fixed. Witnessing is not fixing, but seen, named, described with the precision that transforms a vague, lifelong ache into something you can finally hold in both hands and examine clearly. That shift, from confusion to recognition, from self-pathologizing to self-understanding, does not erase the difficulty of what you carry, but it changes your relationship to it in a way that nothing else can. You are not on your way to becoming someone different. You are on your way back to someone you have always been. And that journey, the one inward, toward the version of yourself that existed before the world taught you to apologize for your own depth, is the only journey that has ever truly mattered.